paper. I'm Fangyuan. So this paper is co-authored with Changen and Almina. Both of my co-authors are here in the Zoom room. So this paper is about motivating inclusion. So let me start right away. What do we mean by inclusion? So what we mean by inclusion is in the most traditional economic inclusion means in order to make competition and to increase profit. So in this presentation, I'm going to use collusion and cartel interchangeably. So it is well accepted that cartel activity can harm the consumer surplus and also the total surplus. So quoted from the Council of Economic Advisors, collusion is still one of the biggest impediments to competition in our economy nowadays. So we know that explicit collusion is not legal. The antitrust authorities all over the world have been trying very hard to curb the cartel activities. However, just like any kind of illegal activities, if there is a huge profit associated, then the legal sanctioning just couldn't prevent people from engaging in such activities. So from 1990 to 2013, there have been over 1,000 investigations against the price-fixing cartels. About 1.5 trillion US dollars amount of sales are affected by these cartel activities. So to understand collusion, one cannot get around with the antitrust law enforcement environment. In this paper, we are going to focus on the US market. So let me first briefly talk about what is the antitrust law enforcement environment in the United States. So in the US, the Sherman Act prevents hardcore collusion, such as price fixing, market allocation, or bid rigging. So there are two agencies that governs the antitrust enforcement. First is the Department of Justice, specifically the Antitrust Division under the DOJ, and also the Federal Trade Commission. If someone or some company commits collusion, there can be criminal charges against them. So the legal sanctions against the individuals can include not only the monetary fines, but also the imprisonment punishments. So the DOJ, Department of Justice, will have the exclusive authority over the criminal charges. So DOJ is a very important player in antitrust law enforcement in the United States. This figure over here, what I'm trying to show is the number of antitrust criminal cases in the United States since 1990. As we can see from this green line, there is a decreasing trend in the number of firms that has been charged for breaking the antitrust laws. However, in this blue line, we see that the number of individuals that has been charged is not decreasing. If anything, there's a little bit increasing in that. This figure over here shows the number of individuals that has been convicted for breaking the antitrust laws and has been put into prison. So again, we see that more and more individuals are sanctioned for not being compliant with the competition laws. So to sum up, there are two important observations from these trends. The first one is we see, although collusion is not legal, it's quite pervasive in the United States. So one thing I want to mention here is that these numbers we have seen are the collusion activities that has been detected by the antitrust authorities. There may have been more such activities that has not been detected. So another important feature here is that we see there is clearly an increasing trend in both the charges and the convictions against the individual investors. So these observations, individual decision makers. So these observations has led us to think about the following question. So if law enforcement has been so harsh against the decision makers, where do they really find the motivations to commit collusion? So so from the law enforcement angle, if we hold individual decision makers more accountable, it essentially reduces intrinsic motivations for more individuals to pursue collusion. But we still see collusion going on. Is there any extrinsic motivations that has been provided to them? So that's the issue that we are trying to explore in this paper. So what we are going to do in this paper is that we are going to look inside a company and to consider the different interests between different parties inside a company in pursuing collusion. So this approach will be very different from most of the IO papers in the literature. Because over there, people usually assume that corporate is a black box. So firms is the entity who makes the decision on whether or not to participate collusion or to deviate from such an arrangement. So what we are doing is really to open this black box and look inside a firm. When we do this, we find agency problem, of course, is a non-trivial issue. So shareholders, as the principal, they may have different interests in pursuing collusion from the CEOs, who is the agent that has been delegated to make the decisions about the strategic behaviors. So there is one special form of agency problem we want to highlight here that is intentionally created by the antitrust enforcement, by this notion of holding individuals accountable. Because holding individuals accountable will expose the CEOs to the legal risks so that it can prevent CEOs from pursuing collusion. However, this notion will usually not expose legal risks to the shareholders because shareholders are usually anonymous. But shareholders can, of course, enjoy the profits coming from a collusive arrangement. So this will create a wedge between the managers and shareholders' interests in engaging in collusion. In addition to law enforcement, of course, the usual form of agency problem also plays a role here. So the managers can have their reputation concerns or career concerns, which further prevents them from engaging in collusive arrangements. So what we try to explore in this paper is what is the tool that shareholders have been using trying to align managers' interests to pursue the collusive strategies. So what we hypothesize here is that since this is an agency problem, we believe that the Euro type of governance mechanism may play a role, for instance, the compensation schemes. So by providing certain types of compensation to the CEO, the shareholders can actually implicitly motivate the manager to pursue the type of strategy that is in the best interest of the shareholders. And the shareholders actually do not need to give a direct instruction to the manager for committing collusion. So this will hedge the board of directors away from the legal risks. Of course, in offering CEO compensation, the board of directors are the agency which represent the shareholders and design the contract. So we think this question is very important because it clearly has policy implications on both corporate governance as well as the antitrust policies. So to sum up, in this paper, what we are exploring is the interaction between CEO compensation and the competition law enforcement. We ask two specific questions. The first is, how does CEO compensation adapt to certain changes in antitrust enforcement? And the second question is, what implications does these changes in compensation have on the latent behaviors that firms have undertaken in their product market competition? So before going forward, let me first talk about the theoretical predictions. So which features in compensation structure do we expect to be particularly important for the competition strategies? So here we highlight two features. The first one is the sensitivity of managerial pay to the performance of a rival firm. Here one can regard the payment to a manager as a function to both the own firm performance as well as the rival firm's performance. So we know that usually firms may start with some scheme like a relative performance evaluation, which essentially rewards the manager for outperforming their peers. When they do this, of course, powerful incentives will be provided to the manager. However, it will also encourage the manager to engage in aggressive competition strategies. So this is if a relative performance evaluation is used, this gamma parameter over here is going to be negative. So if aggressive competition is not in the best interest of the shareholders, for instance, the shareholders may find collusion the optimal strategy for them to pursue, then what they can do is to put a more positive loading on the peer firm's performance. So this is the point that has been made in Agbal and Sandvik in their 1999 paper. A second feature that we explore in this paper is the stock and option compensation paid to the managers. So the equity compensation plays two roles. The first one is to align managerial incentives with the shareholders, and second one, and more specific to the collusive motivations, is that the equity compensation can help to stabilize a collusive equilibrium. So this point is made by Spagnolo in his 2000 paper. The intuition over here is something like that. If we consider a collusive equilibrium as some type of a grim trigger strategy, then by nature it is not going to be stable. Every party may want to increase their production or cut their price in the current period. Of course, when they do that, they may be punished by their cartel partners in the future. So why does equity compensation help with stabilizing collusion? Is because stock price is forward-looking. So if some manager tries to deviate from the collusive arrangement in the current period, then the stock price may reflect the future losses from the punishment phase. So this will decrease the incentives for managers to deviate from a collusive arrangement. To put it in another way, because of the forward-looking feature of the stock prices, if we award managers based on the equity compensation, it essentially increases the incentive horizon for the managers, so that a longer horizon will make the collusive arrangement more stable in equilibrium. Okay, so these are the two features that has clear prediction from the contract theory. So what we do in our paper? So what we have been doing is that we look at a recent regulatory reform that has weakened antitrust enforcement for certain firms. Specifically, this reform that we look at, it has decreased the probability of detecting a collusion, and of course, it will make collusion more appealing for the shareholders. However, this reform has preserved the wedge between the managers and the shareholders' interests to pursue collusion, so that if a contract is designed to maximize shareholder value, we expect to observe certain changes in CEO compensation structure in the direction to accommodate more collusive incentives. Specifically, our prediction is that we should observe more positive relationship between CEO pay and rival firms' performance after this reform, or in other words, there should be less use of the relative performance evaluation. And second is that we expect to observe more equity awards to the managers. In other words, there should be a longer incentive horizon granted to the managers. As a preview of what we have found, we established three main results in our paper. The first one is that we find after this sudden decrease of antitrust enforcement, the affected firms have indeed increased the relationship between their managers' compensation and the performance of the competitors. And in particular, they have been linking their managers' pay to the competitors with whom a collusive arrangement is more likely to be formed. Second piece of evidence that we offer is that these affected firms, they have increased the equity compensation to the CEOs. And the last one is that we found that these firms that get affected by the reform and also change the compensation in those two directions, they have earned a higher profit margin, so which is suggestive that these firms may have been limiting competition in the product market. All right, so now let me talk about the details of our paper. So first, what exactly reform are we talking about? So this reform happened in 2013. The Department of Justice closed 4 regional offices out of the 7 offices. These regional offices mainly dealt with the antitrust enforcement. So these 4 offices are located in Atlanta, Cleveland, Dallas, and Philadelphia. So most of the regional coverage has been moved to Washington, D.C., and some of it has been moved to the other 3 regional offices, which are in Chicago, New York, and San Francisco. So this reform has been primarily motivated by budget cuts, so it's presumably exogenous to the local economy. This reform, by moving away the regional office, it should have made it harder for the Department of Justice to police the regional cases. So to see this, I'm putting here a quote from the Cleveland mayor. It says that closing Cleveland's field office will impair the Department of Justice's ability to pursue effective criminal enforcement of antitrust laws. And the main reason given by DOJ to move these regional offices is to allocate the resource to Washington, D.C. and to focus more on the big and nationwide cases. So our hypothesis here is that such a reform will make it more challenging to detect a local market conspiracy. In other words, it should make it more appealing for firms to collude with the local competitors. So which firms are affected? We argue that those firms whose DOJ field office have been moved further away, and also those firms they had some local competitors. Those are the guys that get treated by this regulatory reform. So the underlying assumption here is that we are arguing geographic distance that matters for gathering information on the local market and regulating the firms. So this table shows the 23 states that has been affected by this event. Those states are highlighted in blue here. And this figure over here shows the number of antitrust filings that has been filed. This solid line here shows the number of filings in the states that has been affected by this event. As we can see that there is a huge drop after 2013. However, for the unaffected states in this gray line, we do not see such a pattern. So these are our identification strategy. Now let me talk about our empirical findings. The first test that we have done is to look at whether or not CEO compensation has really become more positively related to the performance of a local peer. So by local peer, we define it as a firm whose headquarters is located within 200 miles of a certain firm, and also in the same industry that is defined based on Holbrook Phillips product similarity score. So a median firm in our sample will have 1 local peer and 7 non-local peers. The treatment variable that we look at here is a continuous variable that measures the change in the distance between a firm's headquarters to the covering DOJ field office. So what we are doing here is to regress CEO compensation on the own firm performance as well as the stock return of the local peers. We interact these 2 returns with the post-event dummy and the treatment variable, which is the change in distance here. So our expectation here is that this beta 4 should be more positive, and this beta 2 should be more negative. And this is exactly what we have found. We find that the CEO pay has become more positively associated with the performance of the local peers and less sensitive to their own firm performance. So after establishing this, the next question we ask is which component of CEO compensation has changed. So the first thing we checked is whether or not firms have removed the explicit relative performance provision from their CEO compensation, and we find no, this is not the case. The explicit provisions were not really sensitive to this reform. So this would, for our story to go through, this would imply that there must be certain components in CEO compensation that the board of directors has discretionary power to control, and they have been changing that in certain way to facilitate these changes in the peer performance sensitivity. So the question here is, do these board of directors have such discretion, We believe the answer is yes. And specifically, the board of directors can do that by changing the practice of the cash component of CEO compensation. So this is because we find in cash compensation, it is very common for the board of directors to put some subjective performance measures, for instance, the strategic goals. So here are some examples we have found from firms' proxy statements about what do the firms mean by the strategic goals. We find some phrasings like gross margin expansions, long-term contractual arrangements, joint venture, pricing opportunity, long-term growth in revenue and earnings, and so on and so forth. So we do not really find that firms will say directly that they regard encouraging collusion as part of the strategic goal. But what is clear is that the board will have some discretion to control the practice of the cash component of compensation. So what we find in the data is that strategic goals, 90% of them will show up in the cash component, and only 10% of them will show up in the equity component. So when we split CEO compensation into these two components, we find that most of our results are concentrated in the cash components rather than the equity components. And this is suggestive that the board of directors have been actively making the changes to CEO compensation, because it is the cash component that the board of directors has more discretionary power on. So the next thing we want to establish is that whether or not this peer performance sensitivity result is really driven by the local competitors. So what we have done here is that we explore a pair-wise analysis where we create a matrix of all the focal firms and all the peer firm matches, and we have an indicator of whether or not a certain peer is located nearby. So in such a pair-wise setting, we can control for a very rich set of fixed effects that can help us to control for different types of unobservable factors. So this is the regression that we have been looking at. So we are adding one layer of interaction here. So we are looking at a focal interaction. So what this result shows here is that it is the local competitor that has been driving this result that we have found in the previous table. Okay. So that is so these are the first set of tests. The second set of tests we explore is whether or not firms have increased the equity compensation to their CEOs. So over here again, we are looking at a difference in different settings. And the treated firms are defined as those firms whose field office has been moved further away and who had some local competitors. In other words, the treated variable is going to be the changing difference multiplied by an indicator of the of having some local competitors. So the control firms over here will be the firms who didn't experience any changes in their field office, or the firms who didn't have any local competitors. So we run this definitive regression, and what we find here is that those treated firms, indeed, they have been increasing the value of stock compensation, or the combined value of stock and option compensation to their CEOs. So this is very consistent with our prediction. So the last set of results that we explore is something like this. We simply ask the question, does these changes in CEO compensation really work? If it works, which means the collusion is successful, we should be able to observe some changes in the markups, or we should also observe more co-movement in the performance among competitors. So here, what we are particularly interested in is whether or not these two things have changed differently for the firms who really granted more equity compensation compared with the firms who didn't do this. So we are going to regress the gross profit margin, all the stock return co-movement between a focal firm and a local competitor, the interactions of treated and post-dummy, as well as the amount of equity compensation granted to their CEO. So the coefficient we are interested in is really this beta. we expect the beta to be more positive. So this is exactly what we have found. We found the firms, if they increase their stock grant by 1% of the market value of the firm, then the gross margin will increase by 0.5 percentage point after the reform. So we also tried this test in the same flavor with the relative performance evaluation. We cannot do that with the implicit relative performance evaluation or the pay performance sensitivity, but what we have done is to replace this equity compensation variable with an indicator for a firm that do not have the explicit relative performance evaluation provision, because those firms are likely to encourage inclusive arrangements. So what we find is that we still see this type of pattern in the data, which is consistent with our hypothesis. Okay, so I'd like to use the last few minutes to mention a few heterogeneity tests. So the first thing we explored is something like this. We want to know whether or not our results are stronger among the firms who has a better governance structure in terms of the structure of their board of directors. And we find that this is the result. We find this is the case. So if the board of directors had a larger proportion of directors that is not very busy, in the sense that they will monitor the firm very intensively and be more aligned with the shareholders, we find our results are stronger in this set of firms. So this is saying that if the board of directors is more aligned with the shareholders, the firms are more likely to give the CEOs the inclusive incentives after this policy reform. Okay. And the second set of results we find interesting is that we find our result is stronger among the subset of firms whose CEO is approaching the retirement age. So when the CEOs are relatively older, they have less intrinsic motivations to pursue the long-term goals. So this is the case, not very good for facilitating inclusive arrangement. And we find this is also the case when firms begin to give these CEOs more extrinsic incentives from the compensation arrangement to motivate them for pursuing inclusive strategies. And the third set of results here is that we find our results is stronger among the firms who has a more concentrated distribution in their business geographically. So we have explored two types of measures here. One is the locations of firms' subsidiary, and the other is the states that has been mentioned in this firm's 10K. So all of these results are supportive to our story. We also explored a bunch of robustness and falsification tests. For instance, we worry whether this reform has been anticipated, so we do the placebo test by moving the event 4 years ahead, and we find all of our results are no longer holding over there. And also we control for more interactions in our setting. We find our results will remain. And also we try different types of definitions of industry or distance. We find our results are very robust to such choices. So to sum up, so here is the key takeaway from our paper. So our finding suggests that the shareholders or the board of directors who represent the shareholders, they may have the interest to set up the incentive schemes to motivate the managers to pursue inclusive arrangements, especially when the antitrust enforcement has been weakened. And this type of compensation scheme and the latent behavior will hurt the consumer welfare. So although corporate governance standards usually require a better alignment between the shareholders of managers, so the evidence from our paper actually tells a slightly different story. What the evidence is saying is that suppose collusion is in the best interest of investors, then a policy making that cares for consumer welfare may not prefer to promote the highest standard for corporate governance. So this is all about our paper. Thank you very much for listening.
Great. Well, thank you very much,